Hello everyone, and thank you for being here with us today. Merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues standing here with me today. Vadim Prishtaiko, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Ann Linde, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden, Ides Zaman, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Afghanistan, Andrew Morrison, UK Minister of State for International Development and the Middle East. I want to thank Foreign Secretary Rab for also attending today's meeting. I also want to recognize our friend Stef Blok, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, who was with us also today. We stand before you on behalf of the victims of Ukrainian Airlines Flight 752 and want to offer our deepest condolences to their families and their loved ones. We are here to pursue closure, accountability, transparency, and justice for the victims. Ukrainian, Swedish, Afghan, British, Canadian, as well as Iranian, through a full, complete, and transparent international investigation. In the wake of such a horrific tragedy, there are many, many questions. Families want answers. All of the countries assembled here today want answers, and the international community want answered. The world is waiting for those answers, and we will not rest until we get them. À la suite d'une tragédie aussi horrible, de nombreuses questions se posent. Les familles veulent des réponses. Tous les pays réunis ici aujourd'hui veulent des réponses, et la communauté internationale veut des réponses. Le monde attend ces réponses. Today, the members of the coordination group have drafted a framework for cooperation with Iran, which we will publish online later on today. The framework is centered on 5 key elements that will guide our engagement with the Iranian authorities to ensure, first, full and unhindered access for officials to and within Iran to provide consular services. Second, ensure that the victim identification process is conducted with dignity, transparency, and according to international standards, and that the wishes of the families regarding repatriation are respected in all cases. Third, ensure a thorough, independent, and transparent international investigation open to grieving nations, governed by the Convention on International Civil Aviation. Fourth, ensure Iran assumes full responsibility for the downing of Flight PS-752 and recognizes its duties to the families of the victims, including compensation. Fifth, ensure accountability for those responsible through an independent criminal investigation, followed by transparent and impartial judicial proceedings which conform to international standards of due process and human rights. We have seen cooperation from Iran so far, but we continue to monitor on a daily basis and urge continued cooperation. We will continue to share information and lessons learned with each other, to stand in solidarity, and to speak with one voice as we pursue justice for the victim of this horrific tragedy. We will now be pleased to take your questions.
So questions here at the microphone. First question, Paul Workman from CTV. Everyone else can form a line. And no follow-ups, please. Because there's so many of you.
Minister, could I ask you first of all about the repatriation of bodies? Could you bring us up to date on that situation? And could you tell us a little bit about how this criminal investigation would work, where you would pursue it, what charges you might consider pursuing at the same time, and what international body would this happen in, or would it be in Iran?
Well, thank you for this question. The repatriation of body, as you know, the first order that we did was obviously to cooperate with each other with the identification of the remains. As you know, that's why today we call on Iran's cooperation to make sure that the identification and the processes to identify the bodies and the remains would proceed in accordance with international standards. When it comes to repatriation, it will depend nation by nation, because in different cases, repatriation will come at different time. The urgency we have now was to ensure consular services being provided, making sure that the remains would be identified through international protocol to identify the body of the victims. And when it comes to repatriation, this will be organized and arranged on a nation-by-nation basis, because you would understand that different nations would have different arrangement in place. But our first and foremost priority has been to provide consular services to the families of the victims and their loved ones. Sir?
Bonjour, Yannick Dumont-Baron de Radio-Canada. If you allow me to ask in French and ask you to reply in French as well.
I will do whatever you want.
Merci. Vous demandez des réponses de la part de l'Iran. Est-ce que vous remettez en doute leur version, c'est-à-dire un tir accidentel, et vous avez rencontré des représentants des Pays-Bas? Quelle est la leçon la plus importante qu'ils ont pu vous apporter, que vous retenez?
Moi, je vous dirais d'abord, vous voulez ma réponse en français, vous m'avez dit, hein? En français d'abord? Écoutez, effectivement, une des leçons qu'on a apprises de nos amis hollandais, c'était la coopération internationale, de parler d'une seule voix pour s'assurer qu'on puisse non seulement coordonner nos actions, mais parler d'une seule voix face au gouvernement iranien. Et c'est ce qu'on va continuer de faire, évidemment, ensemble. So, to talk about lessons learned with our Dutch colleague was to speak with one voice, making sure that we coordinate our actions and making sure that we continue that work, because we understand that we will have to work together for months and possibly years to come to bring, like I said, closure, transparency, accountability, and justice. This is a process that will take a number of months and I think even a number of years. Écoutez, le gouvernement iranien a reconnu la responsabilité pour le crash de l'avion PS-752. On continue sur cette base-là, mais évidemment, ce sera à l'enquête de déterminer les causes exactes, évidemment, de l'accident et surtout ceux qui sont responsables. So what I was saying in French is that obviously Iran has admitted full responsibility for the downing of the aircraft, but the investigation will now lead to the exact cause, but also taking full account of all those who would be responsible for this horrific tragedy.
Hi, I'm Michael Bossaker. I'm a contributor to CNN Opinion, and I also work the MH17 crash site as a Canadian OSC observer. Bonjour, Monsieur Ministre. Dobronya, Prime Minister. Minister, there was an unexplained 1-hour delay of the departure of PS-752 from Tehran, and there are now rumors or reports starting to circulate that up to 4 people either left the aircraft or didn't board, hence luggage needed to be removed, accounting for that delay. Can you confirm any of those reports or comment on them, please?
Well, I'm not in a position, and that's why I think your question just highlight, as we were talking with colleagues, that's why we need a full, transparent, and international investigations. There's facts that are coming like that day after day that we want a full investigation to assess that and to make sure that those who would be responsible would be held to account. So that's why we are calling as the grieving nations for allowing international experts to participate in all aspects, in the aspect of identifying the remains with DNA experts, in having also experts when it comes to the investigation to make sure. I think what the world is asking today is full accountability and full transparency and full cooperation by Iran. This is really what we are asking, but I think that's what the world community would be expecting from Iran these days. And the answers to your questions and the many questions that the families would have could only come to a very thorough, transparent, and credible investigation that will be carried out.
And just quickly, the TSB chair in Canada cited the expertise built up by the Dutch in MH17. Are you considering inviting them into the investigation?
We're very grateful for the Dutch contribution. We have taken their lessons learned. Minister Bok, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, was spending a good part of the day with us about lessons learned because tragically in MH17 there was some learning, and we certainly want to apply those lessons learned to work in cooperation. We even asked the Dutch government if they would agree to have observer in our different working groups that we have decided to set up, because we want to make sure that, and I think the families of the victims and their loved ones deserve that we use the best possible expertise that you can find around the world and the lessons learned in MH17, because one of the things that as the international community wants is that obviously we want to get to the bottom of things, but also as a world community, the world would like us to think about measures to prevent incidents like that from never happening again. So not only there's a reflection about what is happening today, but we also as the international community needs to make sure that we learn from MH17 and PS 752 and implement the measures to international organization for incidents like that, tragedies like that, never to happen again.
Bahar Khodabande from Iran International. This is for Farsi-speaking audience.
Sure.
The Iranian official, you keep saying that you want Iran to take full responsibility, but the Iranian officials, especially the head of IRCG is one of them, have been blaming the US, United States for this, saying that they started this. If they wanted to use this logic not to comply to what you're requesting from them, then what tools do you have at hand to put, to get justice for the victims who died?
I would say today is not the day for blame. Today is the day for answers. I think that if you were to talk to the victims, like all of us had to meet families of victims and their loved ones, what they have is grief, anger, and they want us to stand for them, like we're doing today, to seek answer in the truth and justice. So I would think that today is not the day to assign blame. It's the day for us to work together to ensure that we would have answers to the questions that the...
Take responsibility, you said, that if they're not...
Well, the Iranian government has accepted full responsibility, but when you accept full responsibility, there's consequences coming from that, and that's what we're going to be pursuing. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. BBC World, European Hub, Olga Malchevska. Is there considers a version that the plane was not shot by a mistake? And also, Iran accepted, as you said, the full responsibility for their actions. And Russia didn't, although there were pretty many evidence by the Bellingcat group. Does it mean that Iran is more open to the international community than Russia? Thank you very much.
Listen, we deal with facts as they are. The facts that are in front of us is that the Iranian government, after evidence came to identify that the plane was downed by a missile, that Iran, I think, which is a good first step, admitted full responsibility for that action. And we are working on that basis now. That's why today we have, as a group, have made demands from Iran to pursue, because once full responsibility has been acknowledged, and that's a good first step, because we want to work beyond that then, is to say, okay, what are we doing with consular services, the remains, the investigation, and the compensation that will come with that. So I would say the investigation will clarify who would have committed that, how it was committed, because we know the cause, but obviously there's a lot of questions, and that's why we leave that to the international experts to determine, and that's why we call on Iran to have a full, transparent international investigation to answer all these questions.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, James Landell, BBC. How confident are you that Iran is going to accept the demands that you've set out today? What have the Iranians told you of their intention? And secondly, if I may, can I ask you, sir, and also perhaps Dr. Murison on behalf of the British government, this afternoon, President Rouhani has announced that Iran is now enriching as much uranium as it did before the signing of the Iran nuclear deal. What is the Canadian government's response to that, and the British government's response, please?
Well, I'll say to your first question, the international community is watching. I think that we took as a first positive step the fact that Iran admitted full responsibility. From that admission, obviously, flow consequences. And we expect and demand a full cooperation from the Iranian authorities in every step of consular services, identification of remains, investigation, and prosecution of those responsible. I will leave the floor perhaps to Secretary Morrison to answer your question, and I'll come after. Secretary?
Well, James, thank you for your question. And can I just thank you, François-Philippe, for convening this, and for the High Commission for your hospitality today, and add my condolences to those that you have expressed on the part of the victims of this terrible incident. James, to answer your question, you'll be aware that the E3 has triggered the dispute resolution mechanism. We do so jointly in accordance with paragraph 36 of the JCPOA. And the reason for that is we want to keep the JCPOA alive. And this is part of that process. We remain committed to it as the best hope for keeping Iran to its obligations, and hope very much we will now be able to move forward on that. We share the same aims, and that is to ensure that Iran does not acquire a nuclear weapon, and JCPOA is the agreement that was designed to prevent that outcome, and that remains our position.
But if the Iranians are now enriching uranium, potentially at 20%, which means the breakout time for them producing a nuclear weapon is reduced rapidly, how concerned is your government by that?
Well, that's why we need to resolve this dispute. You're right, James, to say that Iran has gone past its the fifth stage in this non-compliance. We want Iran to come back into JCPOA so that we can get back on track and give Iran what Iran wants, but ensure that we remove a threat that faces us all, and that's why the E3 jointly has taken that action.
Go ahead.
Baron Abbasi from BBC Persian. When it comes to compensation, do you have an estimate of the amount of the compensation that you're hoping to receive? And with Iran being under sanctions, how are you planning to secure that compensation? And regarding the criminal investigation, are you trusting the Iranian government to carry out an independent investigation? And if not, are you planning to take the case to the Canadian courts or the International Court of Justice?
Well, first of all, on compensation, like I said, compensation flows directly from the full admission of responsibility by the Iranian government. So we would expect them to obviously undertake discussion with obviously the grieving nations with respect to compensation for the families of the victims and their loved ones in accordance with international law. To your second point, I think that's why we want international experts being part of the investigation, because the only way that the international community will be able to judge Iran is that if the investigation is transparent, is full, and that people recognize that there was due process in that investigation, and it's done in accordance with international standards. That's why we have asked the government of Iran to include in all and every steps to have international experts to be part of the investigation, to make sure that the people, the international community, the grieving families and their loved ones will have the answers that they deserve, and full answers and full accountability. So the best way to do that is obviously, and all of the nations that are represented here today have offered to participate and to offer expertise and international experts to be part of the investigation. And we hope and we will demand that Iran includes them in their investigations.
Last question.
Margaret Evans for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. You have a very strong wish list here. I don't think you answered my British colleague's question, though. When you talk about Iran showing its willingness to participate, you'd like to see that continue. What specific examples can you give us in terms of what they are offering for the people trying to go in to retrieve their families' bodies? What are they actually doing? Can you give us some specific examples of goodwill? And also, if that goodwill doesn't continue, then what is this group prepared to do? What tools do you have to try to ensure that Iran actually does give you the cooperation that you're seeking? What practically can you do?
Well, thank you for that question. Like I said, that's why in our words we were careful. We judge cooperation on a daily basis. The first thing we were demanding from the Iranian government was to issue visas, because until and unless we could have our team of experts on the ground, we could not fully participate. So that was step one. Step two, obviously, was to offer and participate in the identification of the remains and bringing best practices and international expertise. We have offered that to Iran, and I understand from my colleagues that there are discussions to have international experts doing that. We judge Iran on the fact of respecting the wishes of the family in all cases when it comes to the repatriation of the remains. We will judge Iran when it comes to the investigation as to whether international experts will be allowed to join in the investigation. We judge Iran on the fact that in the case of Canada, because you were asking me, the Transport Safety Board, 2 experts are now in Tehran, and we have offered also to have experts being there to help when the black box are going to be open. So we are judging Iran every day, demand by demand, and that's what we can say today, that yes, we have good first steps from Iran to allow us to do that. But obviously, let's be clear, this is a long process. So our vision or our assessment is based on the state of facts today. So we have proposed a number of things to the Iranian government. I think what we've asked is not only the grieving nations, but I think that's what the family wants. And I would think under the circumstances that Iran should take the path of cooperation. The international community is watching. There's a path for Iran to continue in the first step that they've done, which is to admit full responsibility. And like I said, when you admit full responsibility, there are consequences that flow from them, and full cooperation is part of that. So that's why we will continue in that, and we will be presenting, obviously, the framework that we have agreed upon as grieving nations to the government of Iran.
What pressure can you bring to bear on Iran?
It's called the international community. The eyes of the international community are in Iran today.
It hasn't.
Well, I would think that Iran has a choice, and the world is watching. It's not just the grieving nation, it's not just the aggrieved families, it's not just the loved ones, it's the families in Iran as well, but it's also, importantly, the international community. Iran has a choice. They can take a path like the one they've taken. The first step was to admit full responsibility and cooperate. And like I said, from that follows a number of demands, which are just logically from the admission of responsibility, which is allow us to go to the bottom of things, make sure that we can get the truth, make sure that we get all the facts, and make sure that the investigation is done in accordance with international best practices. Merci tout le monde. Thank you, everyone.